While I was waiting for you to set up the cameras, I drank some of the beer. I would never drink this with pepperoni pizza. I would never drink this with a lot of things, but yeah, pepperoni pizza would be, or like a hamburger, no. It's gonna feel thicker in your mouth. Those are words that I wouldn't normally want to say together in a sentence. I should probably think about this before we do this. I'm Ben Hock. I've been homebrewing since it's been legal for me to do so. I'm also a certified Cicerone, which is like a sommelier, but for beer. I don't even work in restaurants or at a brewery. I just really love beer. Today we're going to talk about different types of stouts and the foods you can pair with them. Some of them go really well with them. They are so good that I might even be surprised by how good they are. And I don't get surprised. It's a Guinness. This is their Draught Stout, the classic Irish stout that everybody thinks of. They're dark, they look like they might be really heavy, but in reality it's really not. It's very drinkable beer. It's been out in the world for a long, long time. I think it was maybe one of those first beers for a lot of people that they tried that wasn't a blank light. Irish Stout originated in Ireland, kind of in response to the popularity of porters and stouts in England. So there was a stout style being developed in England. It was basically just a roastier, stronger version of the style that was really popular at the time, which was a porter. So that was happening in like the 1700s. In Ireland, they started trying to adapt that style, kind of leaned more heavily into the roastiness. You can see in the light, maybe it's sort of got like a ruby tint to it. Some good smells of coffee. And when you taste it, it's got that dryness to it that's associated with an Irish stout. This beer is classically served in draft form, which is why we've got our Draught Stout can. When you buy these cans, the cool thing that Guinness started doing, I don't remember when, but they developed this ability to basically replicate what you would get if you were getting it from a draft system that was using nitrogen. They have these little, what they call a widget in them that release nitrogen into the can when it's cracked open. So that's when you are pouring the beer, it's got this really cool sensation with the nitrogen bubbles, because they're much smaller than CO2, slowly collect together and work up from the bottom up to give you like a more normal looking head of the beer. That's definitely a distinctive element to this style, is that smooth, creamy, light kind of mouthfeel of that nitrogen. It's a very easy drinking beer. It's only about 4%. And because of that nitrogen, it drinks really smoothly. It's easy to finish a Guinness draft, which is something that I think a lot of people find unexpected with a stout. I think there's this misconception that a lot of people have that a stout is really heavy or it's really like strong. I personally don't find a Guinness to be either of those things. I mean, first of all, it's only 4.1% alcohol by volume, which that's extremely light. But even just the body itself, it's, especially with the nitrogen, it goes down very smoothly. It's not like a filling, like a really hearty or like thick beer. The reason that this style really came about was in the 1700s in England, some brewers kind of stumbled upon a way to roast their grains. So maltsters at that time were figuring out how to roast grains in different ways to create different character for beers. So brown ales started developing. So you weren't just having these like bitters, which were the traditional style in England. You had darker roasts of the barley and of the grains that then could give that character, so the flavor, the aroma, and the color to the beers that they were creating. So that led to the brown ales, it went into porters, and then stout was the next evolution of that. With porters, you had this like sweet, roasty, toasty, but like more on the chocolatey side sort of flavor. And with stouts, there was the introduction of black barley. So like really almost you think of like a coffee bean, like burnt. And it gave you this drier, more, roasted sort of flavor and appearance. Okay. I think that's good for Guinness. So we just talked about Guinness. We're gonna pair it with smoked oysters directly from the tin. We're not putting anything on them, doing anything to them, except for maybe putting them on a little toast. The classic pairing with an Irish Stout is an oyster, so I want to experiment with the smoked variety. I'll take this big guy. Immediately I smell the smokiness, obviously, but also the brininess, the like oceanic quality of it. In home brewing, there's an ingredient we use sometimes called Irish moss, and it's basically like a seaweed, and it smells a lot like this. So the way that I taste beer with food is I take a little taste of the beer, then a bite of the food. This will be kind of a big bite. Salty, briny, smoky, roasty. Those are some good smoked oysters. They're really good. And then with some of the food maybe still in your mouth, take another little swig of the beer. Let it kind of meld in your mouth with the food. Maybe the smokiness of these, it makes them maybe a little too robust to work with the Guinness. I could see this maybe working slightly better with a stronger stout, maybe like a foreign stout or like a tropical stout. But I still really like this with the roasted kind of maltiness of the beer pairing with that smoky and then also saltiness of the smoked oysters. It's really good. I can still taste both the beer and the oyster in my mouth. So to me, that's a good sign that it's like a decent pairing. When people think of Guinness, they probably would expect us to be pairing this with like some sort of Irish food or even an English food. So I wanted to do something a little unexpected. And that's why I chose the smoked oysters. I like it. It's good. The more I drink it, the more I'm okay with that.
I know. I liked it.
Another pairing I really like with the Guinness is lobster. Again, we've gone with tinned lobster, which is kind of different. Zested it up a little bit by adding some lemon and chives and butter. I'm hoping this works. I don't really know. The idea here is the sweetness of the lobster and the acidity of the lemon kind of work together with each other with that like smoothness of the butter. That butter will play really nicely with the like little nitrogen bubbles going on, that smoothness that's going to be in the Guinness. And then the roastiness will help offset some of that acidity from the lemon. The sweetness of the lobster counterbalances all of that roasted bitterness that's going on. So we'll see how it goes. I'm just going to take a little bit of this with my cool fork. Oops. Oh no. Okay. I like it with the toast, these little guys. Or like you could do it with a cracker. You're really replicating or like working with the malt backbone of the beer. That toastiness and that breadiness is a really nice complementary flavor. They're working in tandem. This is really good. I think it works with the Guinness actually. Because lobster really is not, it's not like super strong of a flavor. It's just, it's like delicate, kind of nuanced. And I think that's similar to a Guinness. It's light, but it's still pretty robust and roasted. And that works really well with this lobster, especially the tinned lobster. It's kind of got like, it's doubled down on that flavor. The chives bring like that nice allium characteristic. That's really good. I think, again, you know it's good if you can still taste both of them in your mouth. If you're tasting one more than another, like really dramatically, that's a sign that it's not working. I think I'm starting to like Guinness again. That's actually really good. And we also added a lot to it, which helps it. But like, it was good. Without the toast, might actually be nicer. I mean, it's similar. It's just like the toast isn't doing too much. But without the toast, I mean, I could imagine like a fresh lobster, you're like taking it right out of the shell. And that would be great with this. I think the tinned lobster without the toast gives you that same sort of vibe where it almost feels like the combination feels just like fresher. While Guinness is great, and I enjoy them from time to time, I actually prefer more modern interpretations of the style, American stouts, Imperial stouts, that kind of realm, and that's what we're going to get into. But first, we need to talk about sweet stouts or milk stouts, which are sort of like a natural progression from the classic English styles to American craft beer. That was that widget. They put them in these two for the nitro pour. This is left-hand milk stout. It's the in-between, really, between the Irish stout, the classic, and crazier American Imperial stouts and barrel-aged stouts that have become so popular. It's been around for a long time, so I think people have seen it for a long time. I remember it being one of the first craft beers that I ever had. Maybe it's just because we live in Colorado, but it's still popular. People still love it. But yeah, it's a great example of a milk stout. Milk stout essentially grew out of those classic stouts in England and Ireland to create different flavors. Brewers started adding fermentable sugars and non-fermentable sugars to beers to increase the strength or increase the sweetness. Milk stouts have the addition of lactose, which is like a milk sugar. And so that lactose is not fermentable in the same way that the other more traditional sugars are that are in a beer. What happens is that like lactose stays behind and it creates this sweetness within the beer. Obviously it's called milk stout because of that lactose addition, because of the origin of it. But you've also heard of these referred to as sweet stouts for the same reason, because there's that more residual sweetness that lingers on the palate, and it's really satisfying. Especially, I think of these as almost like a more robust version of a porter, because you get more of the chocolatey kind of notes that you would have in a porter, but they're certainly not as dry. They're like sweeter in a pronounced way, but not an overwhelming way. And I think Left Hand just kind of hit the mark when they created this beer, and that's why it's so well known. Sometimes you might hear the word pastry stout, but those are typically also like, there's more additions than just lactose. It's like there's more going on to make them even sweeter, and in my opinion, disgusting. They're not that bad, but it's just not for me. So in these cans, if you buy a can, it's the same deal as the Guinness can, where they've got the little widget in there with the nitrogen gas. When you open the tab, the widget releases the nitrogen gas into the can, which then creates all these little adorable little bubbles. And it makes the really cool pour that like whoosh, goes up in a wave. It's mimicking like a draft system. It's a great beer. Most Americans who don't drink a lot of beer, they would probably think of like this as a stout and Guinness. So because of the nitrogen, the mouthfeel between this and a Guinness are really similar, easy to drink. However, this has a little bit more of the depth and the weight that I think most people associate with a stout. There's a lot more going on in it flavor-wise, and because of those residual sugars that are lingering in there, it feels heavier, and it is a little bit heavier. So yeah, this is 6% alcohol, so it is just a little bit more in every way. It's gonna feel thicker in your mouth. Those are words that I wouldn't normally want to say together in a sentence. It'll feel more viscous. Because of that added sugar, milk stouts and sweet stouts, they kind of obviously lend themselves to desserts. Milk stout to me, always good with like milk chocolate. That's when you're like talking about, you know, that symmetry where you're going like the same profile together just to like amp them both up. Any sort of coffee dessert would be really good. Also, I've seen people do this where they will pour a milk stout over like ice cream, like a vanilla ice cream. Sort of feel like that's ruining both the beer and the ice cream, but whatever, knock yourself out. I would never drink this with pepperoni pizza. I would never drink this with a lot of things, but yeah, pepperoni pizza would be, or like a hamburger, no. When beers get to this level of like sweetness, just, I try to pair along the same track, not in contrast. The next beer we're gonna do is an Imperial Stout, or a Russian Imperial Stout. And while that style is hundreds of years old, it's really formed the basis of so much of the exploration that has occurred in the American craft beer movement. So I think it's a really interesting style, and it's the next logical progression here from where we are. That's a whole other animal. This is Old Rasputin from North Coast Brewing. And this beer has been around since the 90s. If not the first, it's definitely one of the first Russian Imperial Stouts from an American brewery. There's a bit of disagreement or like weirdness when it comes to the history of this style of beer. But essentially, the story kind of goes that stouts were being brewed in England. Brewers were shipping them to the imperial courts of Russia. Russian people loved them, but the challenge was kind of similar to the like folktale of IPAs going from England to India. It was, how do we transport these beers in, you know, the early 1800s to get from England to Russia and its like territories. More everything was added to make them more robust. It increased the alcohol volume, that increased the stability and the shelf life, and it also made, I think, for the Russians a more enjoyable beer that they liked even more. Russian Stout or Russian Imperial Stout, though, didn't really start being used until like almost 1900. But it's really because this beer style had gotten a reputation and had like created that sort of folk tale kind of history of it. And that's where it gets all these influences. And that's why, you know, North Coast, for example, theirs is called Old Rasputin. It's a pretty big departure from where we just were with milk stouts and Irish stouts. 9% alcohol by volume, which is a pretty big leap from like the 4 and 6. And you can smell it immediately when you give this beer a sniff, as opposed to the others like Guinness, it doesn't really give you a ton when you're smelling it. This, you immediately can get a hint of alcohol. It's at that level where you can whiff a little bit of it. You'll also notice that this, unlike those first two, this is not nitro, this is CO2. And I think actually that helps with this beer. For me, I find it more drinkable because of that. The bigger bubbles, to me, they sort of like break up the viscosity of the beer. It's much thicker. I can feel it lingering on my tongue when I drink it. It's just got a lot more going on in it. This is when people say like, oh, stouts are so heavy. This is when they get heavy. It's like a flavor bomb. It's got that high alcohol volume. There's kind of strength just like running through it everywhere. Really great beer. This specific beer, and why I wanted to feature it, is because I think for a lot of brewers who are working today, this might have been their first experience with a Russian Imperial Stout or just an Imperial Stout. Clicked in people's brains of like, oh my God, beer could be a lot of different things. This is a lot going on. Imperial Stouts have the ability to age because of the strength and the alcohol volume. They also are extremely complex when it comes to the malt, like the grain bill and malt profile that's within them. And in American varieties, just like in American varieties of basically every style of beer, they're more heavily hopped. There's just a lot more going on. Because it is so strong, it's best to pair this with strong foods. This would totally overpower most things. So when we think about food pairings with a beer of this strength and intensity, you want to be really careful to not overwhelm them. It's going to be hard to overwhelm this. In some ways, it's sort of like the stronger the better. Up to a certain point, you still want them to create a harmony. You've got to match the strength of this beer, otherwise whatever food you're eating will be totally lost. I would recommend smoked meats, particularly like a red meat, or even like wild game, like roasted boar sort of thing. That could handle this. They still have that robustness. And I think really of like stews with like cherries and, you know, think of some of those like stone fruits that are, you know, dried and intensified like that. Those are the flavors that would really help highlight the strengths of this beer and highlight the strengths of that dish. And I think it's also maybe one of those opportunities where you could use the beer in the cooking process. I don't think we do that enough. I think it's normal for people to think about wine in that way. But like make a stew, pour some of this in there, you know, see what happens. I think that would be fantastic. Up next, Old Rasputin and creamy blue cheese. Just from smelling this, tasting the beer, I know this is going to be a great pairing. The creaminess and the saltiness of a blue cheese, like that combo, goes really well to work in harmony with the sweetness and the roasty bitterness of Imperial Stout. And again, we're thinking strength and strength, okay? So, oh, that sucks. I'll eat that later. So, so we're working with strength, similar strength, okay? Old Rasputin, again, it's like 9% by volume. A blue cheese like this, super strong on the palate, really intense. You couldn't really pair this type of cheese with many other beers. You could do it with like a barley wine or things like that. It has to be a strong beer to combat the intense flavors and aromas that are present in this cheese. The beer is strong enough to work with it. That's why we can put them together. But beyond that, the nuances in flavor between these two work really well together. I think most blue cheeses would work for this, but I would prefer to use a creamy blue cheese for a stout like this. The texture of it is just more congruent with the texture of this beer. The creaminess plays really well with the roastiness. Think of the interplay between a cream and a coffee. It's kind of the same idea. So the creaminess in the cheese counterbalances the roasty bitterness of the beer. The saltiness of the cheese works really well with that, some of that residual sweetness from like all the extra grains that are added to create this strength of beer. So again, we'll take a little taste of the beer. Strong, robust, delicious. It's a great cheese. Even just taking the smell in of the beer while eating this cheese is like, I can feel the harmony there. It's really good. That's a great pairing. I can taste them both. They counterbalance each other perfectly. I could eat that like all day. I would be faced if I did that, but it's really good. You should try this. That is really, really good. Oh, man, that's bomb. So good. That cheese is also just like really, really good. See, this one's a little more chocolatey looking. Flyby. So this is Yeti from Great Divide, which has, I guess it wouldn't be really a cult following anymore in Denver, but it's a very popular beer here in Denver. They're one of the original Denver craft breweries. They've been around for many, many years. Yeti has always been one of their most popular beers. It has spawned all sorts of offshoots where they've got like different barrel aged versions, different additives like vanilla or mocha. Anybody who's a beer drinker, especially in this region, knows and has had Yeti. It's very good. Super similar to the Old Rasputin, except you can see some of the differences. Just if you look at the heads on these, it's subtle, but you can see this on the right, or on my right, your left is the Old Rasputin. This is the Yeti. The Old Rasputin, the head on it is whiter, or like it's more like a tan or off-white. This head on the Yeti is way more of that like brownish, more like chocolatey looking. They're both Imperial Stouts, but that's one of the cool subtle differences that you might see between different varieties. And I think the way that presents here in flavor, or at least to me, is with the Old Rasputin. It's really more classic. It's like doing the roastiness, and that's like the most prominent, the roastiness, the alcohol, like those are the most prominent kind of things. In Yeti, you're getting a little bit more of the like American hop varietals and the impact of those within the beer, as well as, and I think this is what's dictating the color of the head a little bit more, it's a much sweeter flavor profile and smell than the Old Rasputin is. So you're getting more of those chocolatey kind of flavors, but also I think, like I said, I think it's leaning more into the hops. So you're getting a lot of bitterness, but like hop bitterness, like orange rind sort of bitterness. I think that's something special that sets it apart. It's got like a really great blend between sweetness and bitterness. A lot of coffee flavors going on in it. in like the best ways. It's a delicious beer. It's really good. I think this is very similar to Old Rasputin in like the food pairing department. The nuances lie in the specific flavors and aromas that are going on in this as opposed to the Old Rasputin, which I kind of noted. Similar ABV, so this is 9.5%, the Old Rasputin was 9. A little bit more chocolatey, and at the same time though, a little bit more of that like citrusy bitterness that I think of when I think of like American hop varieties. Too intense maybe to pair with certain savory dishes, but like even if we just think about those flavors that I just called out, like I can imagine really loving this with like one of those classic, you know, like the chocolate oranges that you like smack on the table, like the dark chocolate version of that. That would be like the symmetry sort of vibe that you'd go for. It could do the same sorts of things that we mentioned with Old Rasputin, like stews. At the same time, this is one of those more sipper kind of beers where, and also like if you're drinking a 9% beer, you should be just sipping it anyway. You shouldn't be going anywhere. You should just be sitting on your couch. So yeah. It's a really good beer. Very robust, very delicious, very dangerous because it's so delicious you could drink a lot of it. We've got some amazing brisket and smoked turkey from AJ's Pit Barbecue here in Denver.
You can eat it.
Thank God, because it's so good. Okay, doing this with the Yeti because to me, this barbecue really like, you get the roastiness, you get the toastiness, you get that meatiness, but also there's a certain sweetness that I think pairs really well with the Yeti from Great Divide. Or any sort of like slightly sweeter Imperial Stout. Ooh, yeah, that's good. I think this is also one of those pairings where it's like both things are just so good that it can't not be good together. The brisket definitely works because like just that beef is a stronger sort of meat, but I'm curious to see with the turkey, like how it plays. The thing with this is there's so much smoke on it, and I think it'll work because it has also like a certain sort of citrus kind of profile to it that I think harmonizes with the more citrusy American hops that are in this beer. Yeah, man. I mean, I can still taste both. They're both delicious. That can't be bad. The thing you have to be thoughtful about with sauces is it going to like overspice it? I think with beer of this strength, that probably won't matter. That's the best one. Just do that one.
Okay.
We're going to try with some of the sauce now. God, that brisket's just like incredible. So the sauce, you're getting sweet, you're getting acid. I think those will play pretty well with the beer. What it's doing is actually bringing out more of the character of the like fruitiness of the hops, the citrusiness of the hops. Like that actually almost accentuates the really special parts of this beer more than if you're just having the meat by itself. So I'd recommend if you do it with some of the sauce. It's great.
Any other thoughts?
It's really good. It's delicious. God, that's good. Holy Oh my God. With the beer. That's really, really good. Did you try some? New beer. I chose this one because it's one of my favorite beers, period, not just favorite stouts. AleSmith Speedway Stout, very popular, very fantastic beer from AleSmith from the San Diego area. If you have a chance to go to their brewery that's outside of San Diego, definitely do it. They have like a Tony Gwynn museum. It's pretty amazing. This is one of their best. It's slightly different from the other Imperial Stouts that we're enjoying because this one is infused with coffee. And so that coffee character, while it complements what's already in a standard Imperial Stout, it just gives this beer a different profile. When you drink it, immediately you smell coffee. You kind of smell that with some of the other examples too, even if they don't have a coffee addition. But with this one, it's pretty pronounced. It also has a pretty noticeable, like, syrupy body. It's pretty sweet. When people are like, oh, stouts are so heavy, this would be the example that they're thinking of. Like, this is a pretty, like, stout. But because of the addition of the coffee, I think it's also a lot more approachable than some other Imperial Stouts because it has such a, like, sort of resonant flavor profile that people are already kind of familiar with if they're coffee drinkers. And I think that's part of why it's so beloved. We're gonna try this with some of the brisket too, because I feel like it's gonna be really good. You hear sometimes of people doing like a coffee rub on a brisket or a smoked meat. So I think it'll work in this example. It's gonna be good. Anything with this brisket would be good, I think. Take a bite of the meat. God, that was so good. I think this, especially with the added sauce, will be even better. Sort of like you think of, okay, we're adding some coffee to the beer, let's add some sauce to the meat, right? You're doing additions to both. Yeah, I mean, that's delicious. Immediately when I took a sip of beer after having the brisket in my mouth, the taste of the brisket exploded. Like, it's just there even more. That's a great combo. Fatty beef and, let's see, where are you? Yeah, 12% alcohol by volume stout will definitely do the trick. If you didn't think that brisket could be more gluttonous than it already is, just have it with a Speedway Stout or some other Imperial Stout, because, man, that's a good combination. This is the last beer, Copper Kettle's Mexican Chocolate Stout. It's one of my favorite beers. It's always good. It's been around a long time. Copper Kettle's a brewery that's one of the closest ones to my house, so I go there often. And this is one of their beers that I probably drink the most. The base of this beer is kind of in between the milk stout and an Imperial Stout. It sits at 7% alcohol by volume, so it's still a strong beer. Less of that alcohol character and less of the roasty bitterness, more of that sweetness because of the chocolate addition. And then you get the really special additions of the cinnamon, and they use 3 different types of peppers. And so that combination gives it a really special profile that's really reminiscent of like a Mexican chocolate or like a mole sort of flavor. Could be a beer that you could try with potentially like a really classic mole. It is sweeter though. It's delicious. It's got like the perfect amount of spice. It's not overpowering, but you feel it and you taste it. So this is some homemade ice cream. It's a recipe that's adapted from multiple sources, but basically it's egg yolk, cream, milk, sugar. My favorite flavor of ice cream is cinnamon. So I add like a tablespoon of cinnamon to this batch, which is a lot for like a small batch of ice cream, but I think it's great. Oh, so good. Okay. That was some good ice cream. This Mexican chocolate stout is perfect to pair with this homemade cinnamon ice cream because that Mexican chocolate flavor, it's of course got the chilies, the chocolate, but then the cinnamon, which is kind of, you know, the perfect balance, the perfect harmony here with the cinnamon that's in this ice cream. And then the cinnamon is always there. That chocolate sweetness is there from just the malts, but also the addition of a little bit of chocolate. Like it's fantastic. Then the creaminess of the ice cream perfectly counterbalances the spice from the chilies. The cinnamon connects it. The sweetness connects it. It works really, really well. I think it's a great pairing. Because there's less alcohol, there's less going on in it. The legs are not as long. It's not like as viscous. I think the pairing is pretty fantastic. The other cool thing is the cream from the ice cream. If you take a sip of the beer afterwards, you can feel the CO2, like the carbonation, hit your tongue. And you can feel it bubbling along your tongue, kind of killing off the fat from the ice cream. It's a pretty cool sensation. Oh, great. Let's just do videos of me eating stuff.